Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Cal Rev's The Chest of the Best. The adventurer's best friend, where you can get everything you want for just your top half off. And tonight, we are talking shop. The hiatus is over, ladies and gentlemen. It is finally over. Well, I mean, it ended last week. But now that means that you've had plenty of time to catch up at this point. If not, stop listening. But we are finally getting back to the Office of Incident Assessment and Response, much like whatever was lurking underneath the Institute. It has opened up to us yet again. Or, at the very least, whatever is spying on the OAR is letting us listen in again. This episode was perhaps a bit more tame in its presentation compared to the previous one. Nothing inhuman, implied, or outright rears its eldritch blasted head, but we do see the return of certain elements which give the goals of certain actors well, not a more defined shape, but a less vague shape, if that makes sense. But without further ado, why don't we go ahead and just jump straight into the episode, why don't we? The episode opens outdoors. The sound of automobiles wakes up a sleeping Celia, who curses about this happening again. Before getting up, checking her phone, cursing how it has no signal, before taking off in a direction, saying to someone named Jack that she's on her way. The scene changes to the OIAR, where Sam is dejectedly working when Alice arrives with coffee and snacks in an effort to try and cheer up Sam. It doesn't work, but her efforts do help to put some energy in him, if only just a little. Enough, at least, for him to pull a fast one on Alice and get her to give him a pain au chocolat instead of a cinnamon swirl when presented with the ultimatum. But that's something that we're going to have to come back to. In the meantime, Alice, despite her cheery disposition, seems uneasy. When pressed by Sam, she reveals that she's been feeling this intense feeling of being followed ever since she was at the coffee shop. She has no reason to be sure of it, nor did she see anyone particularly following her, but it's the intensity of it that seems to make her even more uneasy. Sam offers to walk her home after work, which lessens the tension a little more before the two get to work proper. At which point, our incident begins. The incident begins as an email exchange being dictated by Chester/John regarding a cemetery exhumation operation in Padstow, a coastal town that, if based in reality, is on the northern end of Cornwall, England. The email is from one Gordon Allen Johnson, head of a contracted groundworks company, and one Allison, a member of the municipal government, who's hired Gordon to move the bodies of the Padstow Cemetery elsewhere due to the erosion of the cliffside where the cemetery is situated. Now, during the exhumation process, they discover a body that is too perfectly preserved. In a cemetery where all the bodies date back as far as the Victorian era, or early 1800s to early 1900s, it leads the head medical examiner, known simply as David, to declare that all work on the cemetery should cease until he can verify that the body isn't too recent, else the cemetery becomes a crime scene. Gordon notes that the body's back was covered in a vivid tattoo depicting a ship sailing out to sea towards an open horizon and setting/rising sun. As the days drag by, Gordon starts to talk about how calming the waves are, in conjunction with asking that Allison get in contact with David, who, it seems, hasn't given any indication of actually finishing his examination of the tattooed body and is no longer responding to Gordon's emails. The one phone call they had, David seemed to be talking at length about salt water and tattoos. Because of the paused work, Gordon's been dwelling on the sea and that tattoo itself, realizing from pictures that the ship wasn't sailing towards the setting/rising sun. The sun was too far below the horizon and seemed to be part of a vague shape chasing the ship. Gordon also notes that a mysterious figure has been to the site and asking questions. They don't seem to have any distinguishing features, just that they had a huge snake tattoo up their arm. They didn't give their name, but said that they were big online. They were asking about the body, saying that the tattoo of the body was an, quote, Oscar Jarrett, and that it was connected to one Sutherland McDonald. Before taking off, Gordon suggests potentially calling the police, but due to prior arrangements with Allison and attempts to keep the exhumation process under wraps and without any protest, they do not follow through on this suggestion. Now, it should be noted that during this entire time, we are only ever getting Gordon's emails, getting his side of the conversation. Allison's responses are more or less left up to interpretation and inferred from the reaction Gordon gives. As is evidenced the most strongly via the emails that follow this one. You see, 2 days after that email, Gordon is contacting Allison to express condolences at David's passing. And while we don't get a clear indication of what exactly happened to him, Gordon ominously ends his email saying, quote, "If it's any consolation, he's with the sea now. The deep will care for his bones." This seems to strike a nerve with Allison, though, as before, we never see her responses. Gordon's emails become a little more consternated, and he starts demanding to see the body again, saying that he needs to see what's in the water. Then, in a final email, it's revealed that the body was stolen from the medical examiner's office. Gordon saw the serpent-tattooed interloper at the office while he was waiting to see the body. He says that he knows where they're staying, and that they're wrong to think they deserve it. He says it belongs to the deep, and that he will get it back before his email is shown to have been deleted. Well, it's a little confusing. The way that the script is written, it makes it seem like his email got deleted, but at the same time, it's addressed to Allison, whose email is presumably deleted. It's confusing. I try not to dwell too much on it. Anyways, we cut back to the OIAR, where Sam catches on to the fact, as other sharp-eyed or sharp listeners catch on to the fact that the tattoos feature prominently in this incident, calling to mind episode 2, Making Adjustments, which also featured a tattooist with a serpent tattoo who was big online, Ink Soul. Sam asks if there's a way to cross-reference cases that seem to have a relationship, but Alice says there's not. Says cases are all standalone and that they shouldn't be investigating anything anymore. It's at this point that Gwen arrives looking disheveled, but while she admits she's been having trouble sleeping, she's only late because there were technical delays on the metro. There's some of the usual banter until Gwen asks if the coffee Alice brought was for her. It wasn't, but good-natured Sam lies and says yes, even though it was actually meant for Celia, who, as if on cue, arrives apologizing profusely. Gwen, much to Alice's shock and indignation, lays into Celia for being late, taking on the haughty tone of a work superior. Celia says that a leak sprung from her radiator and flooded her lounge. After being forgiven for her tardiness, Gwen leaves to speak with Lena for a debrief meeting. In Lena's office, Gwen demands to know what she was dealing with at Nigel Dickerson's house last episode. She claims that she grew up watching Mr. Bonzo every week and pointedly says that the shambling, sweating mass of skin was not Mr. Bonzo. Big surprise there. Lena, however, is unperturbed, admitting that while Mr. Bonzo is one of their more unsightly externals, it would be best, and in Gwen's interest, to scream next time during these encounters to help cope, and as a means to appeal to the externals, plural. When Gwen asks about the name and address that she gave to Mr. Bonzo, Lena waves her off, saying she's sure that Gwen's already worked out who, but she can keep an eye on the caseloads over the next few days to figure it out. In the meantime, she's to focus on her work until her next externals assignment, saying that the why of it all comes later, and that it's better for Gwen to focus on processing the what. The episode ends with Lena offhandedly suggesting that Gwen should get some sleep. So, yeah. Very tame as far as episodes go, or maybe I've gotten better at summarizing it, but setting aside me giving myself a pat on the back on finally having a proper system for this, it would probably be best if we just go ahead and jump straight into the analysis, why don't we? Starting with the incident, it's hard not to look at this and think Inksel hasn't made a return. It seems fairly clear that Inksel has made a return. Last seen in episode 2, making adjustments. Case CAT 3RB C 1567-2309-2022-1201-2024. There, they were noted as having no other outstanding qualities with the exception of a tattoo of an absolutely gorgeous floral serpent design running up their arm and into their neck. End quote. Here, the incident, or rather Gordy, notes, admittedly blandly, that a similar big snake tattoo was going up the arm of this individual, though they apparently note that there were other tattoos besides. No clear indication whether that is important or not, but it seems fairly clear that the Inksel of episode 2 and the Inksel and the tattooist weirdo snooping around Hadstow in episode 11 are more or less likely to be linked in some measure or way, if not outright being the same person. Now, rather interestingly, it could be important to note that episode 2 actually takes place in September of 2022, whereas here, Inksel's appearance takes place 2 years earlier, January 2020. Now, I don't know if that could mean anything per se. It just helps us establish a timeline as far as I'm concerned. For all we know, this could be a earlier period in time before Inksel. Maybe they didn't have their body-altering tattoo capabilities or the knowledge or know-how to transform a person or give them such bizarre powers as to allow them to change their body at will, but at the very least, we have a timeline of appearances for Inksel. Here's hoping that they stay consistent with the timeline when it was kind of sort of unclear and confusing and conflicted with itself in archives. But that's for us to worry way later down the line. What's more important than Inksel's appearance here is what they're asking for. They say that they're looking for the body, obviously, and they seem to know more about the tattoo than anyone else. So the fact that they know that the person tattooed with it, and Oscar Jarrett seems like a very, very pointed descriptor of that tattoo, perhaps the original artist, and apparently this Oscar Jarrett, whether or not they are the tattooist in this regard, they are connected to one Sutherland McDonald. Now, doing a bit of digging, and by digging I of course mean a cursory Google search, couldn't find anything on a Oscar Jarrett. Or at the very least, I couldn't find any notable historical figures with the name Oscar Jarrett. Just a number, apparently it seems to be a more common name than I would have thought. However, Sutherland McDonald is, interestingly enough, a prominent figure in our real-world history. The IRL Sutherland McDonald was a prolific tattooist from Victorian England, notable for being the first British tattooist with identifiable premises. Now, the fact that Protocol is drawing on some historical figures is just a neat little thing to do. I found it to be incredibly funny. Maybe not funny, but it's just interesting whenever they implement historical figures into their lore and then turn them into something else. You know, you've got your Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer, a movie I did not see, admittedly, but found an interesting concept all the same. In the world of Magnus, however, you get things like Wilfred Owen, the famous war poet, uh, becoming a possibly an avatar of the Slaughter, or possibly an extension of its will in some form that isn't necessarily an avatar. But the more important demonstration of this historical figure reformation would be Robert Smirk of from Magnus Archives, a name that is constantly repeated. The IRL Robert Smirk was a prolific architect, but in the world of Magnus, he was an eldritch researcher of sorts. Still an architect, but he utilized architecture as a means of balancing out the fears who he, in his mind, in his arrogance, if you will, he categorized as being 13 separate entities, each with a inclination towards a specific and deep-seated primal fear. Now, Robert Smirk took on several students, so it leads one to wonder if perhaps, in this case, in this world, the Robert Smirk takes the form of Sutherland MacDonald. Is Oscar Jarrett then a student similar to the students of Smirk, where Smirk is notable for having, I believe, 3 particular students, each, funnily enough, going against his principles and leaning towards specific entities and fears? Is that something that perhaps this Sutherland MacDonald attempted to do? Or is it in the similar sense of Jürgen Leitner? In this case, a separate approach to the fears compared to Smirk. Now, if Oscar Jarrett is a student of Sutherland in the same way that certain characters were students of Smirk, does that mean Oscar Jarrett broke away from this MacDonald and ended up leaning more towards the fears or entities or however they have manifested in this world? Or is it more along the lines of Jürgen Leitner, where the subordinate simply copied his work? No way to tell, obviously, since we don't see Oscar Jarrett appearing in any capacity here. At the very least, we can maybe draw a hypothesis and guess that Sutherland MacDonald serves as something of a Smirk or Leitner, perhaps, in the universe of Protocol. Now, what does that make Inksel? Well, from what we can tell, it's hard to really say. Inksel seems to more or less focus more on the tattooing aspects without really delving into any particular fear itself. Can we consider Inksel to be another student of Sutherland MacDonald, a student of Oscar Jarrett, or do they consider themselves to be something of a indie performer? And, well, a performer for sure, considering the fact that they are a streamer and they make most of their work well known online. But it's, well, not much to really draw conclusions from. All we know is that they are obsessed with tattoos and obsessed with the work of specific tattoo artists. And interestingly enough, the ones that they take interest in are makers of whatever supernatural, spooky, creepy tattoos such as Jarrett or MacDonald. So these are names that we're going to have to keep an eye out, though it makes one wonder what exactly tattoos serve in this universe. It's different, right? It's very different compared to what happened in Archives. Are tattoos the Leitners of this universe? Are they the architecture of this universe? It's not something... It's broad. It's very broad when we look at it within the realm of Archives, even looking at how architecture could be used as some sort of invocation or tool of the fears. It's never truly explained. We just know it to be a rule of the universe, and we just sort of accept it as existing. And honestly, in the realm of horror, that's totally fine. It doesn't. Not everything needs to be explained. And one of the failings of any of comedy and or horror is whenever you explain the joke or show the monster, because the imagination or the mystery of it all is what lends to it its humor for comedy, horror for horror, essentially. So it might be fun to consider the possibility that in this world of protocol, the way the fears and the entities have decided to operate is through the means of tattoos, and avatars, obviously. But I just find it's curious. We never really get an explanation for the books. Leitner himself admits that he wasn't making the books. He wasn't trapping them in the books and utilizing them as a prison. And he did consider himself a warden, a keeper of knowledge and keeper of the entities to prevent their spread, sure. But he never made the books. He simply collected them for his own personal library. Here, instead, we have what could be conceivably be interpreted as actual creation of whatever text could be found in the Leitners. Now, not all the Leitners were in English, and not all of them were in a. Some of them would be in a language unreadable, as demonstrated with the Book of the End, or whatever the name of it was. The one that would depict a person's death. However, that one, notably, would always change the text that would appear in its pages to match the language of those reading it. But there was also a couple of Leitners. One, in possession of Mary Keyes, for example, was written in Sanskrit. So it doesn't seem to be particularly linked to any language per se. However, in the case of the tattoos, it's been notable in that every person that has looked at, whenever symbols are mentioned, they're not recognizable in any meaningful way. Even the symbols implemented into Inksoul's own snake tattoo, which were called into question by Daria in episode 2, she didn't really mention the symbols being recognizable. She didn't recognize any of the symbols that were implemented into her own tattoo when it was put onto her own skin. So, is the power in the person making the tattoo, as it is with Inksoul, or is it in the symbology, which they have implemented in the tattoos put onto Daria, or is it a matter of something else that we simply can't possibly know at this point in the story? Once again, we're gonna have to wait and find out. But I think I do recall saying we would be seeing Inksoul again. And I'm just kind of sort of sitting pretty here, patting myself on the back and being like, yeah, no. And there they are. For all we know, it could possibly be a doppelganger or a repeat person, or just not who we think it is, or just a part of a collective. But the tattoos make another appearance, which calls into question the meaning and purpose that tattoos can serve within this universe, and how they kind of sort of serve a different purpose and different role and act differently compared to the Leitners. Although, admittedly, the Leitners had a wide variety of behaviors. Still, it is interesting to see how they behave wildly different from each other, more so than how they behave differently from the Leitners. Now, speaking of the tattoos, why don't we go ahead and take a step back and look a little more at the tattoo of what lies beneath the waves. Obviously, this is our second incident regarding tattoos, but the effect is demonstrably different. See, In episode 2, Daria's tattoo gave her the ability to alter her body through the medium of paint and her canvas. The tattoo she gained from Inksol being a paintbrush running along her inner arm to her palm, which apparently, based off of what Inksol said right before inking her, it matched her like profession. That was the key thing behind Inksol inking her with a depiction of a paintbrush, and it ended up feeding into her pursuit of personal perfection. Now, in this case, the tattoo is on the back of a sailor. It depicts a ship sailing away from a creature in the water, or at least that's how Gordon interprets it. The effect of it, however, is hard to describe and not easy to narrow down. Well, we can make some inferences. It seems to imply an invoked obsession with the water and seeing what's under the water. We don't really see that culminates in, though. David, for example, the medical examiner, he ends up being obsessed with salt water, the ocean, and whatever it is under the water. Yeah, but what ends up happening to him? We don't know. The only thing that really gives us any indication of his fate is how David ominously ends their email, which seems to imply that David leaped over the cliff edge and drowned himself from the sounds of it. Gordon does say that he's with the deep now and it'll take care of his bones, so presumably that's exactly what happens, but the question is why and how? Or perhaps it's like a gift for Mr. Spider type of situation where you never really know what happens to you until it's too late, until someone yanks the book out of your hands. But in this case, there's no one to yank the book out of anyone's hands. The effect seems to be quite profound and long-lasting. While one could avoid being led all the way to Mr. Spider's house in archives, here, it seems, as with Gordy, even a picture is enough to make one obsessed with the ocean tattoo. In some ways, it's similar to Dig as well, or Ex Altiora. The latter tells the story of a huge creature approaching town, and the townspeople decide against fighting it and instead throw themselves to the rocks below, which kind of gives us an idea of what exactly this tattoo is meant to represent in terms of entity-wise, or rather themes present which allow us to narrow down what is going on. Obviously, the vast is an easy one to basically pin as the culprit of this entity. Of course, I think I recall last episode we would try to avoid narrowing it down to the 13 entities because, well, frankly, that we know that there's a lot of blending going on. So in all likelihood, the blending of the fears is probably going to be the main driving force behind Protocol, more so than Archives. But this helps us try to understand it. We see the ocean. There is also the sense of serenity, knowing how big and constant something greater than you is, which is, again, common theme when it comes to the vast. For example, what's his name? The Fairchilds. Simon Fairchild makes a point of being just very relaxed about everything, just because in the end, the little things don't matter. So that is a point in favor, or rather against, the vast. But there's also other aspects to this with regards to obsession and wanting to know what's under the waves and wanting to understand the unknown. That calls the eye as a potential culprit as well. There's also the aspect, just by fear of the unknown, right off the back, you get the stranger as well. So, once again, demonstrating that the blending of fears is a element covering every episode up to this point, which gives us every reason to maybe pump the brakes a little on attributing entities to any given incident. In any case, whether or not the entities are connected to this tattoo, it's interesting how they are operating through it, and also how they are manifesting as well. If you think about it, the way the tattoo is presented, it a lot of it seems to be rather symbolic when you look at it. For example, when we look at Daria's tattoo, the paintbrush, that was painted along the inside of her hand, essentially, from the inside of her elbow all the way down and extending to her palm, as if replicating how an artist would handle a paintbrush. And in the end, she was able to utilize that, whether by choice or against her will, to fuel her pursuit of perfection and change how she looks. In this instance, the tattoo is spread across the back of presumably an old-time sailor from the Victorian age. It depicts a ship fleeing something, and in true fashion, the tattoo is on the back of the sailor, as if to further enforce that they are being chased. In some ways, that kind of leads the idea that there is also an aspect of the hunt present, the fear that something is out to get you as well. Again, another demonstration of the blending of fears, but what could it mean, right? What could it mean at this point? There's this something chasing after them. Someone put this tattoo on this person, and it clearly affected them right up until they died. The question is, why does it preserve the body? Why does it? And the body is perfectly preserved. The tattoo apparently is so vivid that they can still make out the shapes and forms and images depicting it, and it's symbolic in where the tattoo is placed and what it depicts. Is there power to be had there? Is there meaning in trying to do that? I mean, sure, the entities don't think the same way that we do, and it's hard to make sense of what they're trying to convey to those of us on the material side of things, but there's still a purpose to it. I feel like if we ever see another tattoo again, we could probably stand to pause and try to predict how it will behave in the context of it. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and I'm starting to stray a little bit further away from what's in front of us, and delving too deep into what is yet unknown. For now, we should focus on just how protocol, or maybe even archives, kind of sort of approaches this whole thing. I am struck by what is happening in the sense that it feels like another instance of just someone running into an unstoppable force of nature. John talks about it previously in archives about how taking statements is just a demonstration of survivorship bias. Here in Protocol, we get to see more victims, or technically speaking, we have the opportunity to see more victims, but we've also seen a fair share of people who are victims, just not in the truest sense. I'm trying to describe it, but if, for example, let's look at Gordon here. When it comes for him, it's not an active hunt for Gordon. He's just really unlucky. He isn't an antagonist here, and in this instance, you could argue that neither is Inksoul. Though, this incident takes place in 2020, whereas episode 2 takes place in 2022, so who knows, maybe things changed in 2 years. I guess you could say that they spread the fear via Gordon to Allison, who has to deal with David dying and a contracted employee going crazy, making her the surviving victim in contrast to the others, and a source of the fear, which is to be fed upon by the entities or the eye, since now we know, right? But the question is like, is that the case when it came to the Leitners? When there was no clear avatar or domain of an entity, was it just an accident with dire consequences and a mark of fear? Yet, Gordon isn't afraid here, is the thing. When those people in archives went to the archives to make a statement, they were demonstrably afraid of the freaky incident that occurred to them. And yes, sure, they have seen people that would behave in a way that would feed into the entity and thus become potentially an avatar. Here, it's not what happens. Gordon doesn't seem to become an avatar per se. I mean, maybe if Gordon ever appears again, then we can assume perhaps that he has ascended and become something more than human or less than human, depending on how you want to view things. But I don't know. I've just started to notice that here Gordon doesn't become afraid of what's under the water. He becomes obsessed with it. Which also happened to Daria. She wasn't afraid of her body changing. She became obsessed with changing it. And then the violinist as well. He wasn't afraid of the violin spreading violence. Maybe he was, but that didn't stop him from feeding it. He became obsessed with feeding it because it was his lifeline. I mean, yeah, something else drove them to make their decisions. Daria's body dysmorphia drove her towards perfection. The violinist's obsession with acclamation drove him to kill to feed the one thing that kept him where he was. And then this tattoo feeds an obsession with the ocean, the deep, something in the water. Now, fear still is there in all the statements, but it seems less, I don't know, prominent. Sure, there's no archivist to drag out the more terrifying emotions or experiences, so mechanically there could be a reason as to why we aren't getting a truer whiff of the entities or whatever has become of them now, but it still feels like a theme of obsession is far more present. If you don't believe me, look at each of the episodes too. The first episode, the first incident shows an obsession with lost love. The incident giver, I forgot what her name was. She is so obsessed with being able to talk to her lost love, Arthur, again, that it calls to the stranger, I guess, or gets preyed upon by the stranger. And then, of course, the second incident results in the Institute, which we'll come back to. Don't worry. Next, we have episode 2, which I've already discussed before, Making Adjustments. Perfection. Daria is obsessed with how imperfect she is, that she ends up giving into her pursuit of perfection once she is given the necessary tool to make it possible. Episode 3, Taking Roots, I believe the title was. It was the episode wherein the doctor ended up killing his wife and her affair partner. Obviously, we saw aspects of the lonely there, as well as some parts of the flesh as well, and maybe a little bit of the desolation, but there was this kind of sort of, you could argue that there was an obsession with the perfect image, the image of the perfect marriage, the perfect wife, the perfect lifestyle. It's a doctor with maybe a trophy wife. It's never really touched upon, but hey, that sounds like some sort of like idealistic life. Episode 4, Taking Notes, that is the violinist. And the violinist was absolutely obsessed with rising above their station as a child born out of wedlock to a noble and trying to rise up in the ranks and above their station as the child born out of wedlock. Episode 5. There's an aspect that was the episode of the movie screening. And there's an angle of returning to the past in the sense that in that episode, the forum poster was returning to a horror review blog that they opened up like 12 years prior. And they talk about how they used to enjoy horror because of their father and spending all that time with their father and consuming horror media. And then all of a sudden, at the end, we're hit by the fact that something must have happened to that father and there must have been some sort of accident. And that ends up being what is being preyed upon, is possibly the OP trying to relive what they lost. A kind of obsession, I think. Maybe I'm stretching there, but it's there. Episode 6, inflicting pain. This one is admittedly a little shaky. This is the episode where Needles appears. And you could argue that there's this obsession with inflicting pain, or maybe love, perhaps, considering the way Needles talks about inflicting pain, how it's just a cuddle. Now, you could argue that that is just the sadism talking, but you know, if you are familiar with anime, then you are familiar with the term yandere, which refers to a sick obsession with love, to the point of harming the object of your affection. So, you know, there's an argument to be made there. I don't. Admittedly, I wasn't able to find anything for episode 7, if my notes are any indication. But episode 8 could be a follow-up in the sense that it has some sort of themes of reliving the past. While we did argue that it did have aspects of the lonely and it did have aspects of the extinction, there was also this nostalgia attached to it, in the sense that the person writing the essay talked about how they remembered having a photo that their wife, recently divorced, well, not recently divorced, but divorced wife gave them, which had aspects of like time lapse in it. And it was apparently his favorite gift from her. There's also the way that the restaurant at the top of the tower was returned to its pristine style with 60s decor in perfect condition, and people wearing, well, it wasn't mentioned whether or not they were wearing the same outfits and fashion style as they were back then, but there is an aspect of obsession there, although admittedly this one might be the weakest example. Episode 9, Rolling With It, had some aspects of luck, success. There was perhaps an obsession with showing someone how much better you're doing in life, right? Having success and rolling the dice and just trusting fate to be there for you. And even the person rolling the dice acknowledged that they were just fully invested in the dice and making people experience luck and experience bad luck. Maybe this one might be the second weakest demonstration of obsession, but it's there. And then, of course, we have episode 10, Your Life's Work and Having Nothing to Show for It. Nigel Dickerson, he basically built up this entire merchandise empire in Mr. Bonzo. And now he has nothing to show for it. Sure, he sells merch, but it goes to the people that it wasn't supposed to go to in the first place. And now, at this point, it's too late to give up the obsession, because the obsession literally owns him now. He is literally a prisoner of his former obsession. Granted, that's also probably a little bit shaky, but there's nothing he's a slave to his own obsession. It was the one thing he put effort in for years, and then when it all came crumbling down, he had nothing left. Obsession. And the thing is, it's also prominent in the OIAR team at itself. Look at Sam, look at Colin, and look at Gwen. All right? Sam is completely obsessed with the Institute and finding out why he wasn't chosen for whatever they were looking for in their Gifted Kids program. Sure, there is an aspect of the eye there, and the eye definitely represents obsession as well. There's also Colin, right? Colin is trying desperately, and maybe he's not the only one, but he is trying desperately to figure out how the system and the OAR works, to the point that he'll attack people and he'll sneak into the office, and to the point that he's more or less probably being targeted right now. And then we have Gwen, literally obsessed with having a position in what? An underfunded government institution that very clearly doesn't have any other kind of like upward mobility. It seems to just kind of sort of end with Lena. Or not Lena. Yeah, Lena. Maybe Gwen is also taking some aspects, some aspects from like her namesake, from the Bouchard namesake, because she clearly comes from a family of such high pedigree and standing that she should have something to show for it, and that's what she seems to be trying to do. At least that's what it looks like. Now, I don't know if it means anything, alright? This obsession. It could just be a narrative theme that drives the whole plot forward without having any actual measurable effect on the world, but I was wondering if the fact that the eye led the whole of the thing that was fear into this world, I was wondering if that has something to do with it. Alright? Lead them in, then let them... Yeah. If we look at what happened in Archives, it was the eye that led them into the material world. Alright? Sure, it was orchestrated in the end by the web, but ultimately, it's the eye that was first through the door, and then it was the eye that led them out the gap in reality. So is there a possibility that perhaps by being the first to exist in this world, even if on the immaterial plane, does that lead to some sort of effect on the collective unconsciousness? To feel the eye's obsession, and this obsession maybe sort of feeds into every manifestation of the entities in the material world? Or maybe I'm getting too creative. Both are very real possibilities. And of course, it's not like Archives didn't have themes of obsession. Certain behaviors could be construed as being due to obsession. Anyone who was on the Archives team could be considered obsessed after all. It's just the eye's modus operandi, no matter where you go. But if that's the case, then it seems a bit odd that almost everyone in these incidents, seems to be led on by their own obsession with something. And speaking of Archives, Chester dictated this one, right? Obsessively trying to know what lies beneath the waves seems pretty eye-like, all things considered. But, as always, there's not much we can do this early on. However, if we're talking about things in common between the incidents, maybe we don't need to just look at what's common between who dictates which incident and why, right? Maybe, yes, there is a lot of loneliness that goes on in incidents where Norris comes in. Maybe there are a lot of themes that connect to the eye and the web where Chester dictates. And maybe there is some sort of historical reason that Augustus is dictating specific points. He's only dictated one, but hey, we're eyes out for the next time, right? But maybe we should take a step back and actually look at how the incidences are being connected to each other, what common themes outside of fear, because the more I look at it, the more it seems to me that fear is secondary to an obsession and a spreading obsession. There's something almost infectious about it, especially considering how it's affecting Sam. Speaking of Sam, maybe now's a good a time as good a time as any to go ahead and look at the OIAR. There's not a lot happening, but at the same time there is a lot happening, so we're just gonna try to narrow it down from what we know to what questions we have. Looking at it, we have our post-visit to the Institute. It seems that ever since leaving the Magnus Institute, Alice has been feeling paranoid. It's not something we can just hand-wave. The Institute was, and clearly still is, a stronghold of the Eye. Episode 1 had user Red Canary detail an intense feeling of being watched after exploring the ruins for themselves, possibly after taking something as well before they presumably were attacked. Now, Alice seems to be the next target after visiting the Institute, though we can't conclusively say what is targeting her. Now, if it's the same thing that got Red Canary, the question is who and what. Signs to be on the lookout for? Did Alice take anything? Doubt that. I highly doubt that she took anything worth taking from the Institute, or even anything worthless from the Institute. Now, is Alice being hounded by anonymous DMs? As that was also something that preceded the presumed demise of Red Canary. That's something to be on the lookout for if we are to assume that it is the same thing that got Red Canary, but maybe it's whatever came up from the underground, aka error. Now, question is error what got Red Canary in the first place? If so, how did they get Red Canary in the first place if it seemingly couldn't get out of the underground and into the Institute at all? It seems unlikely that whatever it was that got Red Canary is getting Alice, or is error, just by sheer virtue of the fact that if Red Canary could get in the underground in the first place, why couldn't error get out of the underground? When it seems like that was the goal of having Sam go to the Institute in the first place, was to get the key out of the file cabinet and get the key over to Error's door. We don't know. Maybe there is a third actor in all of this that we need to keep an eye out for. Or maybe it's just the matter of exploring the Institute that does something to people. It wouldn't be the first time. Back in archives, Albrecht von Closen did in fact suffer from something about the books and whatever it was that was hidden underneath the cemetery near his residence that inevitably led to him being cut open after he died by the coroner and finding a bunch of eyes growing on the inside of him. Perhaps there's just something about being exposed to the Institute that gets to you. Hard to say. But the next question to be had then is, why does this paranoia seem to only be focused on Alice? Why is Alice being targeted by whatever it is that came up? And why isn't Sam being targeted? Now, perhaps maybe there is something else there. Maybe it has nothing to do with visiting the Institute. I have doubts about that being the case, but let's look at the possibilities for a second. It could be, and I think this is a bit of not a stretch, but I don't think that's who it is, needles. Nothing really gives the indication again, but maybe I just want to hear needles again. Now it could just be on brand considering the hour. They work late graveyard shifts leading into the morning. It just seems highly unlikely that Needles would be in a position to just sort of spy on Alice. And why would they spy on Alice? I couldn't even begin to guess why, unless there is something in Alice's background that would feed into whatever fear that Needles is trying to foster. However, again, it just seems a little unlikely. The other possibility, and this one also seems to be equally, if not, just equally unlikely, would be Mr. Bonzo. We'll get back to that. Let's go ahead and jump on over to Gwen's debrief meeting with Lena. Can I just say, it's kind of cute that the serious Gwen wasn't so above it all as a child, and that she just watched Mr. Bonzo and enjoyed that show enough to watch it every week. Maybe she was just a bored child, or maybe she really did deeply enjoy Mr. Bonzo and then had that childlike innocence berated out of her. I just find it cute. That said, she is getting a bit of a big head after getting what isn't really considered even by Lena to be a proper promotion. It's just a change of jobs, maybe just sort of like a horizontal promotion, if you will, change of department in a sense. I liked her barbed back and forth with Alice. I would hate for it to become like more than a little barbed. And I don't want to start disliking her so soon in the series, but I mean, everyone makes mistakes, I guess. We'll just have to see how she shapes up and whether that wall she's got up is going to hold as she deals with more externals outside of Mr. Bonzo. Or who knows, maybe she'll have to deal with Mr. Bonzo multiple times over the course of this series. It seems, due to the conversation with Lena, that we were right to assume that the OIAR has multiple contracts going at the same time. Starkwell probably sits somewhere in that mix, but now that only raises questions as to their purpose, right? If the OIAR is willing to use aspects of the entities in their work, then what could possibly be their reason for existing? Maybe their mission statement was different when they were formed and it's changed as time went on, hence the loss of the response department / outsourcing of their work. Or maybe, the entities are properly working together, but then Hilltop Center got torched. At which point, why would Hilltop Center get torched? Like, did the web get ostracized for its puppeteering business? I mean, it always tends to get hated because just by everyone. The Eye doesn't like not knowing what the consequences lead to. The Desolation doesn't like spider webs, I guess. Just doesn't like the Order countering their chaos. So, it's what are they doing? Now, if we were to examine it deep down, we're not going to get anything. There's no way we're going to figure out why the entities are so keen. Well, we don't know if Mr. Bonzo likes being in the pocket of the OIAR, working for them. For all we know, he probably enjoys murdering folks on their behalf, but what about Starkwell? How do they feel about this whole mess? And can we look at the OIAR as a proper stronghold of the Eye? Still, we have to wonder about that. Granted, of course, Freddy always knowing everything and accessing everything. It's been hard to deny it as a stronghold of the Eye, and it remains difficult to look at it as anything else. Even if I still have reason to believe that it's not and is more of a target of rather than a stronghold of. But again, we're veering too much into my creative speculation. Next, we should look at the target of Mr. Bonzo. Apparently, it should be obvious whose name and address Gwen gave Mr. Bonzo. The one that makes the most sense, obviously, up to this point, is Colin, right? Colin's doing a lot of digging. He's messing with the system to the point that, yeah, in an effort to try and decode it all and find the purpose and understand why it is what it is, it's very clear that he's kind of sort of painted a huge red target on himself. And, we have a history of IT managers being silenced, it seems. At the very least, we have one instance. If Lena was tasked with burying a previous IT manager, it stands to reason that Gwen would similarly be tasked with pulling the metaphorical trigger with Colin. And, I called it from the very beginning, but who knows? I could be wrong. Another possibility would be Alice, and she is feeling a sense of paranoia, but it just seems very unlikely. And then again, we've seen the paranoia occur with a visit to the Institute in the first episode with Red Canary, who was presumably unalived by whatever it was that didn't like them taking stuff. But we don't really have any reason to believe that Alice did anything to anger them or took anything, so for all we know, it could just be the eye being a bully again. We don't know. We don't know Mr. Bonzo's modus operandi either. So, in this, we'll just have to keep an ear out for his theme song, because at the very least, we know that he reacts to his theme song very positively. But we'll keep an eye on Colin, and we'll keep an ear out for Alice just in case. And hopefully Sam accompanying her home will do her some favors and help lessen the tension. But it's it's Magnus. You know something's gonna come of this. But then, if Mr. Bonzo is being tasked with taking care of Colin, or Alice, or what have you, the question is, then, what do the other externals do? What are they relied upon, and when, and why? Why was Starkwell in, I guess, Spain or California dealing with this San Pedro Square massacre nonsense, but then at the same time they're also dealing with Hilltop Center? Is it a matter of just like how big the threat is? Is the difference a war zone and therefore needing Starkwell, or just a full-on widespread area that requires a lot of hands versus a singular person wherein subtlety, if you want to call Mr. Bonzo subtle, is the key term and word of the day? When are they called upon? Why are they called upon? It seems that Lena may have another assignment for Gwen, but if it's not a silencing project, then what could it possibly be? I guess we're going to have to find out. Maybe we're going to see the proper response protocols in action. So let's look forward to that. I'm not looking forward, obviously, to Colin biting the dust here, nor I expect Colin to bite the dust more sooner than Alice. But, been surprised by a lack of plot armor before, so we'll see. But whether you're looking forward to it or not, we're going to find out sooner rather than later. And then let's have a nice little look at our mystery and biggest, well, maybe not biggest mystery, but our returning figure, Celia. She wakes up in the middle of nowhere from the sounds of it. There's the sound of a motorway, and from the sounds of it, this has happened before. While it's not explicitly said, at the very least, we have a more in-universe and solidly established reason why she might be interested in cases relating to teleportation. As for who Jack is, no clue. It seems odd to mutter a name in this situation in general, but setting that aside, there's no significant person named Jack in archives. except for maybe Jack Barnabas, but he doesn't factor prominently into the story, though his actions are pivotal in the want for a nail sense. Although, it wouldn't be too bizarre if, perhaps, whatever purpose that Celia finds herself in the universe of Protocol, maybe in the Archives universe, they have gathered those deeply affected by the change, or entities altogether, and kind of sort of like made them do stuff as like some sort of crack team. I couldn't even. Well, we know that we can see why she might be interested in teleportation a little more clearly now, since she seems to be waking up and sort of glitching around the place. In any case, we don't get answers. The audio switches soon after, and we continue the episode as always. We may not get an answer to her teleportation thing. We don't have an indication of how often it happens, but clearly it happens enough to inconvenience her a lot. It should be worth noting, however, that we still listen in on her, right? It's worth noting that while we are listening in through her phone, she pointedly says that she doesn't have signal, which gives a very terrifying implication that an internet connection is not necessary for whatever is listening to tap into it. And it can arguably put the tape recorder as a possible means of listening in for them as well. However, I still stand by the idea that the tape recorder, due to the fact that it has no connection and is much more in line with the web's bizarre way of working things, I am still convinced that the tape recorder is a sign that some other faction is at work, though the culprits, while they can be narrowed down to the web, with the way everything is spiraling out of control, it's hard to make a definitive claim. Now, my next question, though, is why would it choose to listen on her now? Unless she pops in and out constantly, and whatever's watching has now decided to take a vested interest in her. Maybe she pops in and out around maybe she's been in this universe for a good long while. Assuming that she is a universe hopper to begin with, maybe she's been hopping around over and over and over again, but the only reason that it's become prominent is because she has joined in on the team. And now there is a fixed interest in her. However, that could just mean nothing. After all, Lena, in her attempt to murder Klaus, was recorded, and that was brought to the forefront. So that might just be a fault of the narrative and us coming in media res for a given definition of the term. Nothing can be gleaned from this. However, we do know that she is a teleporter of some sort, and whatever triggers it, we'll just have to be on the lookout for. Now, there is one last thing I want to cover before we end this episode. Speaking of the medium and Freddy I keep saying Freddy. For all we know, it could just be nothing, but we'll keep saying Freddy. But whatever is looking, the medium of the series as a whole requires a bit of... It needs to be addressed now. Because something has come to my attention. Now, when I do these, when I listen to the episodes, when I write my reactions, when I come up with my analyses, my hypotheses, my theories, and all that red stringing conspiracy wall nonsense, I try not to look at the comments under the videos until after I finish organizing my own reaction, as I don't want to be influenced by others' theories too much. That said, I do like comparing and contrasting. It's something that I missed out on with Archives as I jumped in when the final season was underway. Still, I try not to see other theories too much, because if I do get influenced, I won't know where my theory ends and theirs begins. And I don't want to pull a Somerton, you know? That said, several comments brought something to my attention that we will want to keep an eye out for. So I mentioned earlier how Sam tricked Alice into giving him the pain au chocolat instead of the cinnamon swirl. YouTube commenter ClaireBear0925 pointed out that there's a noise that comes up at that point. I'd describe it as being a glitch audio cutout sound. It's high pitched, it's short, but it's distinct as a sign in the change in audio quality. And it happens at multiple other points. It happens when Sam says he's fine. He's not. He's obviously not. It happens when Alice says she's not worried about anything. She is. She's paranoid about being followed. It happens when she says she's just jumpy. She's not. She's terrified. When Sam says the coffee Alice bought is for Gwen, it's not. It's for Celia. And it happens when Celia says there was an emergency at home, and she explains that the radiator sprung a leak. But we know she wasn't home. She woke up in the middle of nowhere. Claire suggests that the glitching sound occurs whenever anyone tells a lie. Now, I've been using an official transcript to follow along when I prepare, and this sound effect is not there. In archives, plenty of times, a static occurs when blatant supernatural powers are at play. Like, for example, whenever John uses his eye abilities to drag answers out of someone, or whenever Helen or Michael come through the door, or when just anything, right? Anything blatantly supernatural happens, the tape recorder, the magnetic tape experiences some sort of audio distortion or static. But usually that gets noted in the transcripts as occurring. In this instance, that sound isn't noted in the transcripts. Now, maybe this is just a power play by our writers to ensure that no one catches on it too soon or too quickly. But this sound effect is there often enough, plenty of times, and with very clear evidence to support it, that it leads me to believe that there is a lot of merit to this claim, to this idea. And there's evidence to suggest that it is, in fact, what is happening. I think this if Claire Bear 0925 is listening, I think you're absolutely on to something. I think that this is worth paying even closer attention to with regards to the medium and with the way that this story is being told. All right? I've talked at length about how even the use of magnetic tape served an ultimate purpose in the grand scheme of archives, and have been pondering so much what good a stored database of binary code used to capture voices will serve whatever hidden agenda is at work, right? Like, why is the OIAR doing what it does? And if indeed this is the work of the web trying to recreate its previous success, or the eye trying to recreate the web's previous success, what good is using binary code instead of tape? What is the purpose? What could it serve in this situation? And I was so preoccupied with wondering, with like sorting out the blending of the entities and trying to decipher what their purpose could be and whether or not they're trying to do the same thing, which, those theories still stand. Nothing has really gone on to disprove them, especially so early on, but it's made me neglect to take a step back and examine the finer points of the, shall we say, spy's behavior. Exploring the hypotheticals that are perhaps too creative, absorbing the content, and ignoring the method. If, indeed, our spy reacts so notably to lies, then that means, one, unlike in archives with the tape recorders and the web, the I think, is explicitly at play, as if that wasn't clear already. With the tapes, it was always implied that the I was active in that instance, because it seemed like it always wanted to know things. But then we learned that that was not a consequence of the I, rather it was the machinations of the web in its ultimate goal at the end of the series itself. Here, though, the way that it reacts explicitly to people means that the entity that relies on knowledge and knowing the truth and seeking out the truth, it feels too characteristic for it not to be. 2, we now have tools to notice gaps. Whatever is spying on the OIAR is limited in focus. The scope is wide, sure, and it can clearly access technology both offline and potentially off the grid entirely if the tape recorders are indeed part of its network, but it clearly can't see everything everywhere all at once. We could write that off as dramatic narration, but I'm inclined to believe that the writers put a lot of thought and purpose into their creative choices. Whatever is listening is limited in what it can hear, which means we as an audience are limited by what we can hear. Now, noting that lies have an inherent tell, we can, however reliably, start asking questions. Sam wanting pan au chocolat is just playful teasing and helps further show that he knows Alice well, right? And we heard Celia when she woke up by the road. We're already suspicious of her, so we expect lies from her. But now, if we hear a high-pitched squeal and we have no context, then we'll know someone is lying. Tone of voice and silence can imply it well enough, but we can only infer from that by itself. And sure, given the context, it stands to reason that everyone's lying about something, but now we can question when they lie, why they're lying. Of course, that'll just leave us with more questions to speculate about, but it's something. It's something that we can all, as a community, start talking about and wondering about and trying to, get creative with. That's the fun part of this, right? It's the creativity and trying to piece together all the little tiny threads and see if they paint the canvas in a way that makes sense and in a way that is accurate to the author's intention. Now, one thing I want to point out, it should be noted that around 1606 in the episode, there is an audio glitch when Alice says that it's best to not investigate cases. As a matter of opinion, it seems a bizarre thing to lie about, and if it were a lie, the idea of Alice thinking that it's best to not investigate cases, if that's a lie, it kind of runs counter to everything that Alice has been preaching and acting upon. So it leads me to wonder if there's something there or not, as if our listener is reacting less to a lie and more to the idea that not seeking knowledge is the best course of action. Because of that, I don't think we can always rely on the audio glitching out to be indicative of a lie. Rather, we can reliably consider it to be a lie or a reaction of some sort by whoever is listening. In this case, some sort of avatar of the eye. Probably. Most likely. I really do think that the audio glitch that happens when at 1606 is slightly different, whereas every other lie glitch is high pitched and more of a squeal. It's more of a stutter at that point. And I don't think Alice is lying about her opinion on the matter of investigating cases. I'm just fairly convinced that rather than considering it a matter of, oh, this is a lie, oh, this is a lie, I think it would be best to look. It might be best to do what Alice, and I guess probably the vast majority of the theory crafting community is doing, and just assume that our listener, our programs, and our dictating Chester, Norris, and Augustus are, in fact, more than what they are, more than just a vocal program, more than just a than ones and zeros listening in on them, and is actively, not just actively spying on them, but reacting as well, and having emotions and reactions to what occurs just as much as we do. And in this case, I think that whatever is listening in thinks that Alice is wrong to think that pursuing the truth is wrong. But that having been said, that is where tonight's episode is actually going to end. I believe the next episode, episode 12 of Magnus Protocol, is going to drop in a couple of hours. In the meantime, I'm gonna go ahead and get some rest, get some sleep, and think more about my my life's decisions, specifically the decision to hyper fixate on the Magnus Protocol. I'm having fun, and I hope you guys are having fun. For those of you who caught up and are listening in on this, please, by all means, if you're listening to the VOD, post your theories in the comments section or drop them into the Discord if you'd like. Drop a like, drop a subscribe, follow me on Twitch, and I hope you guys have a fantastic morning, afternoon, evening, whatever the time is in your neck of the woods. But with that being said, guys, shop's closed. Get out. Bye-bye.